Hey guys, this video is for APUS. Remember, watch this video from start to finish. If you didn't watch yesterday's video, please watch that first before you watch this one. Also, remember next week I'm going to be leaving you a video on next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, as well as that weekend after New Year. So 4 videos to come. So please make sure that you watch those next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the following weekend. I'll post it on Sunday for you guys to watch. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the emergence of Depression era demagogues. Now, not a demigod, that's something completely different. Now, a demagogue is somebody who basically appeals to a political leader usually, but sometimes it could be, a spiritual leader or a business leader, but usually they're talking about somebody in politics who appeals to the worst instincts in people. So leaders who appeal to people's fear, to their prejudices, to their envy, to their greed, basically appealing to the worst instincts in people in order to advance themselves and get power. So that happens quite a bit. People have accused the outgoing president of being a demagogue, someone who appeals to people's worst instincts in order to gain power, who divides in order to gain power for himself. So we've had demagogues throughout history. Luckily, in the United States, there haven't been that many who've actually reached high levels of power. In the South, yes, there are a lot of political leaders who actually became influential, capitalizing on their racism. So maybe I take that back. There's actually a good number of demagogues, particularly in the South. But nationally, there really weren't that many demagogic leaders. Demagogues usually have the most influence or the biggest ability to gain power during bad times. So when times are tough economically, or when a society is going through a rough transition and people are anxious, often demagogues capitalize on that frustration, that anger, that anxiety in order to advance themselves politically. Another hallmark of demagoguery is basically putting out very simplistic solutions to complex problems. Something that's easy for people to digest and accept. So, but again, they're just putting this out there as a way to gain power for themselves. So basically, somebody who appeals to people's worst instincts in order to gain power for themselves by putting out simplistic solutions to complex problems. So that's what a demagogue is. There's a lot of them in Latin America and in other countries that whose democratic traditions aren't as strong. Often demagogic leaders kind of rise to the fore and actually gain power, even though ultimately they almost always doom themselves. Because they just push things way too far, and ultimately all their flaws just kind of become fatal, and they ultimately destroy themselves. That happens to almost all demagogic leaders. So during the Depression, economic times were really, really bad. So people were receptive to the appeals of demagoguery. Now, there's left-wing demagoguery and then there's right-wing demagoguery. Left-wing demagoguery usually relies on class warfare rhetoric by basically demonizing the rich, but blaming them for all of society's problems. Right-wing demagoguery is different. Usually, it relies on blaming certain ethnic groups, for the problems of society. So it's a lot more of nationalistic. Left-wing demagoguery tends to be more class-based. So we had a really prominent left-wing demagogue and a right-wing demagogue during the Great Depression who actually became quite influential for the times. So let's start with the right-wing demagogue, a man named Father Charles Coughlin. Yes, Father, he was a Catholic priest. They called him the radio priest because Father Coughlin used to go on the radio and give his political and economic sermons. He didn't just talk about religion. He talked about politics, about the economy, and put out his solutions for these problems. Now, he broadcast from suburban Michigan. He actually was Canadian born, I think. But he broadcast from Royal Oak, Michigan, and his radio program ultimately reached millions of people, and that was actually listened to by millions of people. Excuse me. Now, at first, Coughlin actually preached support for the New Deal. Roosevelt or ruin, he actually said. He attacked the big banks. He attacked the capitalists for causing the Great Depression. But as time went on, Father Coughlin began turning against the New Deal, and he condemned FDR's supposedly cozy relationship with big bankers. Remember, FDR is the one who actually saved banking, right, and saved capitalism. In his, in the words of a lot of contemporaries, he saved capitalism from its worst excesses. So someone like Father Coughlin, who was very skeptical of banks and corporate America, didn't like the fact that Roosevelt actually was trying to save capitalism, because Roosevelt was a mainstream liberal. Now, Coughlin did advocate wealth redistribution. So there was a lot of like populism in his pitch. But as time went on, he began focusing on the Jews as being the biggest problem in American society, as basically being the ones responsible for causing the Great Depression and any assortment of social ills. He began blaming the Jews. He began blaming the Jews for causing the Depression, for being ruthless capitalists. But at the same time, in quite a contradictory argument, Father Coughlin began attacking the Jews as being too cozy with communists. And Coughlin's focus, as time went on, changed from the big banks to hatred of communism and hatred of the Jews. To him, it was one and the same. Coughlin began, in many ways, getting more involved in politics. He actually formed his own political party called the Union Party to oppose FDR. And Coughlin's anti-Semitic tone became more pronounced as time went on, blaming Jews for banking problems and the spread of communism. And he actually put out his own anti-Semitic magazine called Social Justice, an ironic name for such an ugly publication. And he delivered his speech from Goebbels in the Bronx. He actually spoke at Yankee Stadium. If we were actually in class, I would have actually played you this speech, but you can actually, if you want to, go yourself on YouTube and just type in Father Coughlin, Coughlin, and listen to some of his speeches. He had, he was very bombastic, and really spellbinding in a way that was kind of similar to, well, you'll see when you hear. Now, this is what he said in his speech, which was a translation from Goebbels, which he gave in the Bronx, home of a lot of Jews. Coughlin said, "When we get through with the Jews, the treatment they received in Germany will be nothing." Now, this is before the Holocaust, but still, this is the Nazis already come to power and were passing pretty repressive anti-Semitic laws. So, in many ways, Father Coughlin was the embodiment of a U.S.-born version of Christian fascism. And he increasingly began supporting Germany and Italy, the fascist powers, thinking that they were going to be a bulwark against the communist Russia. He was very isolationist, did not really want to get involved in world affairs, because he thought that would, if we do, it would be on behalf of banks and communists. So Coughlin became, at least in the eyes of FDR, a threat to national security. And FDR actually was kind of pulling out all the stops to try to get Father Coughlin's license to actually go on radio actually pulled, or at least trying to pull the radio stations that were actually airing Father Coughlin's sermons. Ultimately, the Archbishop, his superior in the Catholic Church, ordered him back to the church and said that, priests should not be having anti-Semitic radio programs. So Father Coughlin ultimately obeyed his superior, and he left his radio program, and he kind of disappeared, even though he lived for another 35 years, I think. But Father Coughlin was kind of the U.S. embodiment of what was going around the world at the time, the rise of fascism. The world was going through a really rough time in the 1930s. The 1930s were horrible all around the world. And, when people are desperate, often they need someone to blame for the problems. Father Coughlin and other fascist types, gave people the group to blame for the problems of society. And he said it was the Jews. And as we know, a lot of other fascists around the world did the same. Fascism it's weird because fascism, of course, is right-wing extremism. It's right-wing demagoguery. But at the same time, like sometimes when we think right-wing, we think like uber capitalist and, being very free market stuff. But these sort of right-wing nationalist fascist types actually, in many ways, were anti-capitalist. They really did not believe in like kind of free market principles in the way that we might think of um, right wingers being today. Even though people who are like that, people who kind of believe in laissez-faire economics and less regulation of business and all that, actually the correct term for them is classical liberals, right? That's a term that goes back to Adam Smith's time. So these kind of right wingers actually were not free market people at all. They tended to be anti-corporate, and actually were supportive of a welfare state as long as the benefits went to the right people. Okay, now the other demagogic leader of the time would definitely fit more in a category of left-wing demagoguery, and his name was Huey Long, the Kingfish they called him. Now Huey Long was the governor of Louisiana and a senator from Louisiana. At one point, he served in both positions at the same time. Can you do that? No, but he just did it anyway. Louisiana politics is really unbelievable, right? We could have a whole class just discussing that. In many ways, Louisiana politics is very, is more of another world. Like, it's more like Latin American sort of political system than the rest of the United States. Now, Huey Long was a radical populist who advocated wealth redistribution. And he actually started his own program in the 1930s called the Share Our Wealth Program. I actually played, and again, this is something we miss out, by not having class, but I play a speech by Huey Long as well. And Huey Long just basically, he gives this speech attacking the wealthy, saying that why should they have so much and there be so many people in America who have so little. Every time I play that speech, there are always some people in the class who say, well, isn't he right in what he's saying? Especially in the Depression. But Huey Long was also very corrupt. His solutions to the problems were very, very simplistic, which we'll talk about in a minute. And he had really no respect for democracy. So yes, I think he does definitely fit, even though some of his economic message might be appealing to some people on the liberal side, but his whole persona and the way he kind of went about things was very, very demagogic. Now, he completely controlled politics in his state as governor and as senator. Like, he was pretty much a dictator. They tried to impeach him once as governor. He called the National Guard, basically, to try to take over the state capitol. So, see what I mean? Like, not much respect for democratic principles. But he did do a lot of things for Louisiana. He actually built a massive public works campaign throughout the state, building important buildings, including a new state capitol in Baton Rouge, which is still standing to this day. Often that's another thing that demagogues do. In the first few years, they actually do things that the people like. And that's what kind of earns the people's support in the beginning. The fact that, they're doing things to actually help. They have to, right? If they're incompetent from the very beginning, they're not going to be very effective demagogues, and they're not going to hold power for very long. But he earned a reputation as a friend of the poor. Now, at first, he supported Franklin Roosevelt, but ultimately turned against Roosevelt because he felt FDR was too conservative. And he opposed FDR's attempts to save big business, to save the banks, because he was a radical leftist. Now, FDR reviled Huey Long. He said he's the most dangerous man in America. That basically he was interested only in power, and he was putting out super simplistic solutions to that people would find appealing in the midst of the suffering of the Great Depression. And FDR really tried to undermine Long politically. But Long was very influential. For a while. He founded the Share Our Wealth program. It was a membership club that was open to people throughout the country. It had 7.5 million members at its peak, so it was quite significant. He wanted some of his proposals. He wanted to limit yearly income to $1 million. Everything you make over $1 million would be 100% tax on it. He wanted to limit inheritances to $5 million. And he would take all that money that he got in raising taxes on the rich by giving every household in America $5,000. You know, which was an enormous amount of money for the early mid 1930s. He said every American family should have a minimum income of $2,000, and his slogan was "Every man's a king," and that was if you were a member of the Huey Long Share Our Wealth Club, they used to give out buttons which actually said that every man's a king, every woman's a queen. They had a whole song, with that slogan as well. Now, it was rumored that Huey Long had presidential aspirations. In fact, he wrote a book in 1935 called "If I Were President." But a lot of people actually say that Huey Long's real plan was to actually, support a third party candidate in the 1936 election, which would divide the vote, get FDR defeated. A Republican would win in 1936, and then he would run as a Democratic candidate in 1940. At least that's what was rumored to be Long's plan for the long term. Now, he was basically an authoritarian. He really had no respect for checks and balances, really no respect for basic democratic norms, really in any way. And his style was classic third world style dictator. Populist appeals, friendly policies to the poor, desire for absolute power, hoping that the poor would actually just support his economic policies, and then would turn a blind eye to the fact that he was running things so dictatorially, suppressing people who opposed him. So this, even though the message was kind of important, it made some important points, right? About, the fact that there were still so many people who were mired in poverty in the 1930s. He really was an imperfect messenger, to put it mildly. Now, Long's political career ended in 1935 when he was assassinated in Louisiana, actually in the state capitol that he had built. So you could actually, the bullet holes are actually still in the state capitol. They actually never fixed them. I guess is like a living tribute to Huey Long. He was killed by the son-in-law of a judge in Louisiana that had opposed him, and then Long got kicked out of the judiciary. So his son-in-law then came to killed Huey Long. I don't know, that whole story always seemed a little bit strange to me. But that's the official story about how Huey Long wound up losing his life and never getting to the point of actually becoming a national figure. So Long has died, but the thing is, Long's liberal ideas actually did have its political influence because he was so popular at the time. He actually inspired FDR to actually go further left in the Second New Deal. Inspired in a good way, but actually pushed FDR to actually go more left. Partly to respond to the threat from Huey Long that Huey Long could actually pose. So that's probably Huey Long's biggest positive contribution, to American politics. Well, assuming you're a liberal. Now, both Coughlin and Long fit into a very un-American mold. This sort of demagogic, populist, almost pseudo-fascist, authoritarian messages and styles. But the popularity of both Coughlin and Long do kind of show the depth of desperation that a lot of people were feeling during the Great Depression. They were willing to turn to basically anybody in order to do something about the Depression. Now, another man who's often grouped with Huey Long and Charles Kopp, which I never really think is completely fair, was a man named Francis Townsend. Now, Francis Townsend was a California physician, and he actually proposed his own plan to end the Depression. He said everybody over 60 years old should get $200 a month, with the requirement that they spend all that money in 30 days. So the idea was to give old people some support, but at the same time stimulate the economy, right? They'd have to spend it, in a 30-day period in order for them to get it. To help the elderly stimulate the economy and also encourage retirement. We didn't really talk about this, but the thing is that older people who were employed tended to stay in their jobs for a very long time during the Depression, because there was nothing out there, right? If they retired, they would have no way of supporting themselves. So older people held on to their jobs. And the reason why that was bad on a macroeconomic sense is that a lot of young people couldn't find jobs because older people were holding on to their jobs. So it would actually ease old people into retirement, Townsend said, and actually free up their jobs for younger people who need work. Now, the plan was completely unrealistic, which is probably why he's grouped as a demagogue. If you paid all the people over 60, $200 a month, that was greater than the entire United States budget. I guess we wouldn't have an army anymore or something. But it did provide some of the inspiration that FDR used to ultimately create Social Security. One of the reasons why he did that was a response to pressure from Townsend. There were actually Townsend clubs throughout the country that were actually promoting, Townsend's ideas. So this combination of Coughlin, Long, and Townsend did for a time pose a strong challenge to Roosevelt's presidency and Roosevelt's leadership, and actually did nudge him to, at least in the case of Long and Townsend, to go in a direction which was further left. But at least in the case of Coughlin and Long, it's very good for our country that they didn't gain even more influence, even though they did have enormous influence. All right, guys, very good. So thank you for listening. Remember, watch these videos from start to finish. Make sure you watched yesterday's video. If you're at this point, then I guess you watched this video. Now, remember, I'll send you a reminder, Google Classroom as well. But remember, next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I will have videos posted, so please make sure that you are watching these videos. I can't think of any better. If you have a bit of a lull, like during your break, you want to get some history, then it would be a good time to watch these videos. So have a Merry Christmas and enjoy a few days off, and I will see you next week through these videos. All right, guys. Peace.